Why Canadian domestic flights are so expensive. The average price for domestic flights in Canada is around $200. This is more expensive than domestic airfares in other countries and jurisdictions like the European Union, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. For instance, at the time of this video, the average price for a round trip from Vancouver to Montreal is about $250 to $500. But in the United States, Seattle to New York is roughly $200 to $300 for a round trip. And this is about 100 miles more in terms of distance. This makes Canada a place that's not just known for its maple leaves and stunning landscapes, but also its expensive domestic flights. Unlike booking a budget-friendly flight across Europe or hopping on a last-minute deal to a sunny beach destination, Canadian domestic flights can leave you feeling like you've just paid for a first-class experience, even when you're stuck in the middle seat on the airplane. But why is this so? Why are domestic flights in Canada so expensive? Buckle up, because we're about to break it all down for you. Let's start with the most basic principle: supply and demand. Airlines are businesses, after all, and their goal is to make money. This means that in all their operations, these airlines have to factor in operational costs and profit when fixing the prices of their flight tickets. Now, for Canada, one major factor at play is the country's size combined with its relatively low population density. Think about it. Canada is the second largest country in the world by landmass, but its population is concentrated in pockets around major cities. This means airlines have to spread the cost of operating flights across a smaller pool of potential passengers compared to, say, a densely populated country like the United States. Imagine filling a plane from Toronto to Yellowknife, or having tons of passengers on a plane headed to a remote northern town. That's not exactly an economical use of fuel or crew, and it doesn't have the same economic benefit as having a giant jetliner full of tourists heading to Florida. Which means that such trips will consequently lead to higher fares to make up for the empty seats. This is quite different for countries like the United States. The US airline industry, for instance, has a much higher level of competition. It's like a bustling marketplace overflowing with airline options, from established airlines to budget carriers. And this abundance of choices creates a price war, with airlines constantly offering lower fares and deals. While in Canada, the domestic market is dominated by a smaller number of airlines, leading to less competition and potentially higher prices. No doubt, Canada's vastness is undeniably awesome, but it poses a challenge for airlines. And maintaining a network of airports and flight routes for all these far-flung destinations can get pretty expensive. Unlike high-traffic routes in Europe or the US, airlines can't rely on sheer volume to bring down costs on less popular routes within Canada. Another factor is the lack of competition. On many domestic routes in Canada, there simply aren't enough airlines to choose from. So this limited competition allows existing airlines a bit more room when it comes to pricing, knowing passengers might not have many other options if you need to get from point A to point B quickly. It's like having a city where all good pizza places in town are owned by the same company. You might still get a decent pizza, but the price would probably be a bit higher. That's kind of what's happening in the Canadian domestic air travel market. Unlike the US, with its plethora of budget airlines vying for passengers, Canada's skies are dominated by a few major players, namely Air Canada and WestJet. And this limited competition allows them to set prices without too much worry about who might offer a cheaper alternative. So it's not exactly a free market free-for-all, and unfortunately, the one paying the price is often the travelers. Although budget airlines have started to emerge in recent years, they haven't reached a critical mass that created the kind of price wars seen in other countries. Next is operational cost. Operational costs also play a big role in the price of domestic flights in Canada. We all dream of that picture-perfect vacation, probably a quick trip to experience the magic of the West Coast, or a whirlwind weekend exploring the towns along the Maritimes. But the reality is, those travel dreams can come at a steeper price tag than you might expect when it comes to the price of flight tickets, and a major culprit here is cost. To be honest, running an airline isn't exactly a budget operation, and Canada is no exception. Operational costs like fuel, labor, and airport fees tend to generally be higher here compared to some other countries. And just like everything else seems to cost a little more in Canada, these expenses inevitably get factored into ticket prices, making them steeper for Canadians. Things like the cost of keeping those runways clear in the middle of winter, or the salary that pilots and other airport workers are paid. All these add up in the end, causing a baseline for operational costs to be pricier in the end. It's a bit of a domino effect. A higher cost of living means airlines have to spend more to operate, which means they charge passengers more to fly. Places like the United States, however, do not have it this bad. Generally speaking, the cost of living in the US is lower than in Canada, and this includes things like wages, salaries, and operating costs for businesses. Even airlines are no exception. When it comes to staffing airplanes, pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew, airlines in the US often benefit from a larger pool of potential employees willing to work for slightly less compared to Canada. So this eventually translates to lower overall operating costs for US airlines, which can then be reflected in lower ticket prices for passengers. Taxes also typically play an important role in the aviation industry. In the US, for instance, the government imposes a few different taxes on domestic flights, like the ticket tax and passenger facility charges, PFCs. Things like these can add a noticeable chunk to the final price of flight tickets. But luckily, these taxes aren't always consistent, and this is where the US typically has an upper hand. Some smaller airports might forego the PFC altogether, making flights departing from them inherently cheaper. Also, there have been periods in the past where the federal government temporarily suspended these taxes to stimulate travel during economic downturns. In Canada, however, things are a bit different. In fact, according to a recent study from the Montreal Economic Institute, the federal government fees imposed on airlines and airports are a significant factor contributing to the high cost of domestic air travel in Canada. In the publication, Gabrielle Guyer, public policy analyst and author of the study, explained that the government prefers to treat airports as cash cows, rather than the essential transportation infrastructure that they are, adding that taxes have a direct effect on the high cost of domestic travel in the country. In terms of cost, the Canadian government isn't exactly shy about adding its own layer of expense, as airports in Canada are subject to high rents and taxes, which airlines then have to factor into their pricing. Canada has various taxes levied on domestic air travel, including a goods and services tax, GST, and a federal excise tax. And while these taxes might seem small on their own, they add up, especially combined with the already high airport fees. So, this high GST and excise tax can be more like extra toppings on an already expensive airline ticket. Although it might not seem like much individually, together they can make a significant difference in the final price. Airports need revenue to maintain their infrastructure, from runways to terminals to security systems and air traffic control. However, with a smaller pool of passengers compared to busier airports in other countries, and coupled with high levies and taxes, spreading these costs across fewer travelers can lead to higher fees per person. Let me say though that the government's intentions here aren't necessarily malicious, as these taxes and fees often go towards funding important initiatives relative to air travel safety and security, as well as infrastructure development in smaller airports. However, the unintended consequence can be a burden on travelers, especially those in tighter budgets. So it's a never-ending cycle. The government squeezes the airports, and the airlines in turn squeeze the passengers. Another critical factor is the lack of budget airlines. Just like government restrictions and taxes, the lack of budget airlines are also keeping domestic airfares high in Canada. But before you write off all hope of ever affording a domestic flight within Canada, there are a few glimmers of hope on the horizon. For one, budget airlines are slowly starting to make their presence known in the Canadian market, which could introduce some much-needed competition and potentially drive down prices. Flair Airlines, Swoop Airlines, and Lynx Air are all considered low-cost airlines, and according to experts, this type of airline is a really big part of making booking flights affordable. For instance, when Flair launched from Montreal to Vancouver, this was a pretty popular route that was routinely around $500. but the price has dropped since then. This means that when other low-cost airlines launch the same route, then bigger airlines like Air Canada can lower their prices. This may not be as low as in countries like the US or in the European markets, but the price reduction will surely be worth it. External factors such as international competition can also play a crucial role in lowering the price of domestic flights. If it's cheaper to fly from Toronto to Europe than it is to fly from Toronto to Vancouver, that can put upward pressure on domestic fares to cut down their prices. So airlines need to remain somewhat competitive on a global scale. And sometimes that means domestic routes end up subsidizing cheaper international options. Additionally, there's always the possibility that the government might take a closer look at the taxes and fees levied on airlines, which could have a positive impact on ticket costs. Overall, Canadian domestic flights might not be the cheapest way to get around, but understanding the factors behind the higher prices can help you make informed travel decisions. And while a good number of these solutions are still in the works, there are a few things you can do to avoid exorbitant flight ticket prices, one of which is being flexible with travel dates and booking in advance. This can help you get some decent deals. Who knows? Probably with a little planning and some patience, exploring the beauty of Canada by air wouldn't require breaking the bank entirely. Now, this is not to say that flying domestically in places like the US is always a budget-friendly experience. In fact, the reality is that, just like in Canada, factors like distance, time of day, and demand can all influence the price of a ticket. However, the overall landscape of lower operating costs, a less tax-heavy environment, and a more competitive market allows for more frequent deals and generally lower baseline prices for domestic flights in some other places other than Canada.